She was sitting at a table for 8 and every other chair was empty. That was the first thing I saw when I walked into Patsy's diner that Saturday evening. A woman alone at a long table with a paper banner taped to the edge that read "Happy Birthday" in hand-lettered capitals, each letter a different color, careful and deliberate and bright. There were 8 plates set out, 8 glasses, a small cake in the center with unlit candles, and one person, sitting very straight, looking at the door with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting long enough to stop expecting anyone. I almost kept walking. I'd come in for a coffee to go, same as most Saturday nights when the clinic ran late, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was the banner. Maybe it was the way she held herself, not collapsed, not tearful, just very still, the way a person goes still when they've decided not to let themselves feel something in public. I picked up a chair from the nearest table. I carried it over and set it down across from her. And I said, "Happy birthday. My name is Cal Merritt. I'm 31 years old and I work as a veterinary assistant at Elkhart Animal Clinic on County Line Road. It's not dramatic work. Most days I hold nervous dogs while Dr. Vasquez draws blood, or I comfort cats who have just had indignities done to them that they will never forgive. I clean kennels, restock supplies, and answer the phone with the same cheerful opener 200 times a week. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment on Birchfield Street that I share with a 13-year-old beagle named Patterson who limps on cold mornings and refuses to eat anything but one specific brand of food that Elkhart has to special order. I have lived in Elkhart my whole life. My mother still lives 15 minutes away. My father passed when I was in high school. I have one friend group that goes back to middle school, a standing Tuesday poker game, and a garden plot at the community center that produces more zucchini than any reasonable person could consume. 2 years ago, I had a brother. Danny was 26. He died in March, a car accident on the bypass. Nobody's fault, just ice and bad luck and the particular cruelty of an ordinary Tuesday. He was the one who called on birthdays. He was the one who remembered what you asked for and showed up with exactly that, wrapped in whatever newspaper was closest. He was the one who made a table feel full just by being at it. I had not celebrated a birthday since his. My own had passed twice unremarked, which I told myself was fine, which it mostly was, which it also sometimes wasn't. That's not why I sat down across from the woman with the paper banner and the empty chairs. I want to be clear about that. I didn't sit down because I was sad. I sat down because something about the scene felt wrong in a way I couldn't ignore, the kind of wrong that asks you to do something about it. Her name, she told me, was Wren Hadley. She was 29. She had moved to Elkhart 3 months ago from Columbus and didn't know many people yet. I said, "How many did you invite?" She looked at the empty chairs. 7. 2 had other plans and texted that morning. The other 5 she'd met at her co-working space downtown, and she hadn't been sure any of them would actually come, and none of them had. She said it plainly, the way you say something when you've already made peace with it. She wasn't asking for pity. She was just answering my question. I flagged Patsy, who I've known since the 4th grade, and asked if we could light the candles. Patsy raised an eyebrow at me in a way that meant she was already constructing a narrative I would have to address on Monday, but she brought matches anyway. Wren looked at me when the candles were lit. The light caught the edges of her features, dark hair pulled back unevenly, paint on 2 of her knuckles, a slight smile she seemed to be trying to contain. "What are you doing?" she asked. I said, "Singing would be embarrassing, so I'll skip that part. But I figure you should at least get to blow out the candles." She blew them out. She didn't make a big production of the wish, just closed her eyes briefly and blew, and the candles went out and the diner smelled like warm wax and buttercream. I stayed for an hour. We ate 2 slices of cake. She cut them herself from the center because she said the icing ratio was better there. And we talked the way strangers sometimes talk when one of them has done something slightly unusual and the other has decided to allow it. Easy, careful, curious. She was a freelance illustrator. She specialized in botanical subjects, plants and insects and the small things that didn't move fast enough to escape being looked at. She had a website and a client list and worked from home in an apartment on Maple that she said had good north light. She'd moved to Elkhart because rent was reasonable and the city she'd been living in had started to feel too loud in ways she couldn't precisely describe. I said, "Elkhart is not loud." She smiled. That was the point. There was something behind the smile that I couldn't name yet. Not sadness exactly. Something that had been worked through and wasn't finished yet. I noticed it and I let it sit. It wasn't my business, not on a first conversation, maybe not for a long time. When I left, I paid for the cake. She objected and I said, "You made it yourself, which means you already paid for it once. This is just covering the table." She looked at me. "Okay," she said. "Thank you, Cal." I walked to my car in the November dark and sat for a moment before I started the engine. Patterson was waiting at home and I should go. But I sat for another minute, thinking about the paper banner and the 8 plates and the way she'd said it plainly. None of them had come without asking for anything. I thought about Danny and the birthday calls and the newspaper wrapping. I thought about how sometimes a person doesn't need to be saved from a situation. They just need someone to show up inside it with them. I drove home. The next time I saw Wren was 5 days later at the hardware store on Main. She was standing in the paint aisle with a small tin of something called Old Moss Green and a look of concentrated uncertainty that I recognized from the clinic, the face of someone who wants to get this right and isn't sure they will. I said, "That's a good color." She looked up. Her expression shifted into something warmer when she placed me. "Cal." From the diner. I said the cake was good, by the way, the chocolate layer. She said it was my grandmother's recipe. She seemed pleased that I'd noticed. We walked out at the same time and stood on the sidewalk in the cold for 10 minutes talking about nothing in particular, her apartment, the North Light, what parts of Elkhart she'd found and which she hadn't yet. I mentioned the community garden and she asked about it with genuine interest. She'd been trying to grow herbs on her windowsill and the basil kept dying. I said I'd give her cuttings from my plot. She said she'd probably kill those too. I said basil is dramatic but forgiving. She'd be fine. She laughed, and again there was the thing behind the laugh, the slight distance, like she was watching her own emotions from one step back. I didn't push at it. Some things need time to be earned. I brought the cuttings the following Saturday. She was home. She let me in. Her apartment was exactly what I'd imagined from the outside, and nothing like I'd expected once I was in it. Small, yes, and the light was good, the north-facing windows gray and even. But every surface had something on it, plants in terracotta pots, stacks of reference books with pressed leaves tucked into the pages, jars of brushes arranged by size, botanical illustrations pinned to a board above her work table in a grid that was precise and beautiful and felt like being inside someone's mind. She made tea while I got the cuttings into a pot she found under the sink. We sat at her kitchen table and she showed me what she was working on, a series of illustrations for a children's nature guide, each one a different insect, the kind of patient close-looking that most people rush through. The detail in them was remarkable. You could see the individual hairs on a bumblebee's legs. I said, "These are exceptional." She said, "The beetle took 3 days." The way she said it, not complaining, not proud, just matter of fact, told me something about how she worked. With complete attention. Slowly and without shortcuts. We talked for 2 hours. About her work in Patterson and the clinic and the particular way small Midwestern cities hold themselves in winter. She had grown up in Columbus, had lived in Pittsburgh for a while, had spent time in some places she mentioned only in passing, not dismissively but carefully, like she was deciding how much to offer. I watched her hands when she talked. She gestured without realizing it, small movements that seemed to diagram whatever she was saying. When she talked about the beetle, her fingers did a shape that was probably the beetle's carapace. When I stood to go, she walked me to the door. I said, "I'm at Patsy's most Saturday evenings if you ever want to not eat alone." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I'm not usually good at showing up to things." I said, "You showed up to your own birthday party. That counts." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. There was something real in it this time, closer to the surface. After that, showing up stopped being a question, not in a dramatic way. More like the way a path gets worn into grass, gradually, by repetition, without anyone deciding it would become permanent. She started appearing at Patsy's on Saturday evenings. I stopped staying only long enough for coffee to go. We fell into a table in the back corner and stayed until Patsy came by with the look that meant the kitchen was closing, and had we considered that other people might want to go home. Ren ordered the same thing every time: grilled cheese, no pickles, extra mustard on the side. I said once that it was a very specific order for a new person in town. She said she'd been eating that sandwich since she was 8 and she didn't see a reason to change. I liked that. The fidelity to an 8-year-old's correct decision. She started bringing her sketchbook. Not to draw during our conversations, but the way some people bring a book to carry, like an object that made her feel settled. Sometimes she'd show me something. Once she turned to a page covered in preliminary studies of a carpenter ant and described in complete seriousness what the ant had been doing when she observed it. It was building something. She'd watched for an hour. I said, "You have a lot of patience." She said, "I have a lot of practice not moving." It was the kind of statement that arrived with more behind it than the words said, and I noted it and let it sit. I was starting to understand that Ren communicated in layers, the outer layer informational and pleasant, the next layer closer to something she was still deciding whether to say. One Saturday in December, a cold one, she was already at the table when I arrived. She was holding a mug with both hands and looking at the window, and something in her posture was different, less settled, more weighted. I sat down. She looked up and the expression shifted, became more ordinary. I said, "Bad day." She said, "Complicated week." She didn't say more and I didn't ask. We talked about other things. But when we were leaving and I walked her to her car, she said, "My lease is probably ending early." I looked at her. She said, "The building's being sold. The new owners want to renovate. They've been making it clear they'd prefer fewer tenants." I said, "There are other places in Elkhart." She said, "I know." She didn't say the thing she meant, but I could hear it, the question of whether she would stay. I said, "North Light is particular but not unique. There are other apartments with north windows." She looked at me in the streetlight. She said, "You're not supposed to know that's the thing I'm thinking about." I said, "Basil, though, fragile in new environments, needs consistency." She smiled, and it was the closest thing to real that I'd seen from her, the kind that involved her whole face before she could moderate it. She said, "Good night, Cal." I watched her drive away and stood on the curb for a moment. The cold came down on my shoulders, and I thought about the carpenter ant building something, and patience, and the practice of not moving. The complication arrived in January, and it didn't arrive quietly. I was waiting at Patsy's when I saw Ren come in 15 minutes late, which wasn't like her. She was usually early by exactly the amount it took to settle in and put her hands around a mug. But that night she was late, and her face when she came through the door was closed in a way I hadn't seen before. She sat down. She said, "My mother's in town." I'd heard almost nothing about her family in the 3 months I'd known her. She'd mentioned Columbus without detail, the way a person mentions a place they left. I said, "How long is she staying?" Ren said she didn't tell me she was coming. She just showed up. I waited. She said, "My mother and I have an arrangement. We don't usually see each other without warning. It's better that way." She picked up her mug and set it down without drinking. When we're in the same room without enough preparation, we tend to have the same conversation, which doesn't go well for either of us. I said, "What's the conversation about?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Whether I'm all right." The way she said it, two small words that held something large, told me this was the thing behind all the other things. The careful distance from her own emotions, the layers of communication, the practice of not moving. I said, "Are you all right?" She looked at me. For the first time, she didn't moderate the expression. She said, "Mostly. Mostly I am." I understood then that there had been a time when she wasn't, and that the time hadn't been that long ago, and that moving to Elkhart with its reasonable rent and good north light was part of the recovery from it. Whatever it had been, I didn't ask. It wasn't the right moment, and I didn't need to know the specifics to understand the shape. I said, "Your mother came without warning because she's worried." She said, "She's always worried. She doesn't express it in helpful ways." I said, "Most people don't." She studied me. She said, "You're very calm about things." I said, "I work with frightened animals." "You learn that calm is the most useful thing you can bring." She said, "Am I a frightened animal?" I said, "Most useful. I didn't say applicable." She laughed. It was the real laugh again, the one before the moderation. She let it go. I don't know exactly when it happened that I understood what I felt. Probably it had been building for weeks without announcement. But that night at Patsy's, watching her let the laugh go, I understood it plainly. She said, "I need to see my mother tomorrow. It's going to be difficult." I said I could come. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Cal, that's not," I said, "it doesn't have to be anything. I can just be there." She looked at her mug. She said, "She'll disapprove of you." I said, "On what basis?" She said, "You work at a vet clinic. Your truck has a dent in the rear panel. You would not fit into her idea of what my life is supposed to look like." I said, "And what does your life look like?" She said she wants it to look like my life before. Before I had what she calls the episode, which is not what I'd call it. She said this evenly, looking at the window. I said, "What would you call it?" She said, "A year of understanding what I couldn't keep doing." I thought about Danny and the ordinary Tuesday and the ice and how sometimes the most important things happen without warning and without a shape you can prepare for. I said, "I'd still like to come, if you want." She looked at me. She said, "You're unusual." I said, "I've been told." She didn't say yes and she didn't say no. She said she'd think about it. Diane Hadley arrived at Wren's apartment the next afternoon in a coat that cost more than Patterson's medical bills for a year. She was 60, sharp-featured, and held herself with the particular posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that the world should meet her standard rather than the reverse. She shook my hand when Wren introduced us, and her grip was firm and her eyes were measuring. She said, "Cal, what do you do?" I said, "Veterinary work. Elkhart Animal Clinic." She said, "Ah." It was a small word that carried a significant judgment. I noted it without reacting. We sat in Wren's kitchen, the three of us. Wren made coffee. She moved quietly, purposefully, the way she worked at her table, with complete attention and without rushing. I watched her mother watch her. Diane said, "This apartment is quite small, Wren." Wren said, "The light is good." Diane said, "There's a building in Columbus I looked at last week that would suit you. Good size, reasonable for the neighborhood, close to the clients I know you've been losing by being out here." Wren said, "I haven't lost clients." Diane said, "You had a contract renewal last spring that didn't come through." Wren said, "I chose not to renew it. The project wasn't right for me." Diane said, "You chose a lot of things recently that weren't obviously in your interest." It was a clean sentence. The kind that sounds almost reasonable until you understand what it means. I said, "She has a nature guide coming out in the spring. The illustrations are exceptional." Diane looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating. She said, "You've seen them." I said, "The insect series, the beetle detail in particular." There was a brief silence. Diane said, "Wren's work has always been good. That's never been in question. Her choices about where she lives and how she arranges her life are what concern me." She said this to me, not to Wren. Like I was someone who might serve as a go-between. I said, "With respect, she seems to be doing that well." Diane said, "You've known her 3 months." I said, "Yes. And in those 3 months I've seen someone who knows exactly what kind of light she needs to work in, exactly what her grandmother's cake recipe is supposed to taste like, and exactly how patient you have to be to understand what a carpenter ant is building." Diane looked at Wren. Wren was looking at her mug. After a long moment, Diane said, "I'm not the villain, you know, in whatever version of this she's told you." I said, "I don't think she's told me a version. I think she's let me draw my own conclusions." Diane held my gaze, recalibrating. She said I was frightened. When she left Pittsburgh the way she did. The sentence came out with something human in it, something that had broken through the posture. She looked briefly like a different person, someone with a daughter who had scared her badly. She said, "I'm still frightened." The kitchen was quiet. Wren had put her mug down. Wren said, "I know, Mom." She said it without accusation and without warmth, just plainly, the way you say a thing that is simply true. She said, "I'm not in Pittsburgh anymore. I'm here, I'm working. I have North Light and I'm growing basil and I have someone who brings me cuttings." She glanced at me briefly. She said, "I'm not asking you to stop being frightened. I'm asking you to let me be all right." Diane pressed her lips together. I watched her do the calculation between the fear she'd carried for 2 years and the evidence in front of her, the apartment with the good light, the work pinned to the board, the coffee her daughter had made without being asked, the even tone she was using. She said, "You look well." Wren said, "I am." Diane looked at me again. She said, "You're very direct." I said I grew up with a father who wasn't, and I learned it was inefficient. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. She stayed 2 hours. When she left, she hugged Ren at the door, brief, a little formal, the hug of two people who were still learning what their relationship was now. But she hugged her. When the door closed, Ren stood in the middle of the kitchen. She said she'll call tomorrow. She always calls the day after because she processes things overnight. I said, is that useful? Ren said, sometimes. She said, Cal. I said, yeah. She said, you didn't have to do that. I said, I know. She looked at me. There it was, the real expression again, the one without the layer in front of it. She said, I'm not ready to tell you everything yet. I said, I know that too. She said, but I want to. I said, I'll be here when you are. She looked at me. The apartment was quiet. The botanical illustrations were pinned to the board, the beetle and the bumblebee and all the patient small things that held still long enough to be truly seen. She crossed the kitchen and kissed me. It was brief and certain, the kind of kiss that isn't a question. When she stepped back, she looked at me. She said, you're going to be very hard to get rid of. I said, I've been told Patterson said the same thing. She laughed. The real one, the whole face, no moderation. Diane called the next morning. Ren was in the middle of it when I arrived at the apartment with 2 coffees. She mouthed sorry through the window and let me in. I sat at the kitchen table with Patterson on my lap. I'd brought him for the company and listened to half a conversation. Ren said, Mom, I'm not going anywhere. Yes, I know it wasn't what you expected. No, I think that's the point. A long pause. Ren said he brought me cuttings so the basil wouldn't die. I think that tells you what you need to know. Another pause. She said, I'll call you Sunday. Yes, I love you too. She hung up and looked at me across the table. She said she approves of the basil reasoning. I said, good. It was my strongest argument. She said she wants to come back in March when the nature guide is finalized. I said she can have the corner booth at Patsy's. Ren smiled. She sat down and picked up her coffee. She said I left Pittsburgh because I wasn't well. I don't mean I had a bad year. I mean I'd been running a version of myself that wasn't sustainable for a long time, and it finally stopped working all at once. I put down a contract that was important and I stopped answering the phone and I didn't leave my apartment for 11 days. She said it carefully, the way she talked about the beetle, with complete attention and no shortcuts. She said, I moved to Elkhart because no one here knew me before. I wanted to see what I was when I started from the beginning. I said, what did you find? She said, someone who is mostly all right. Someone who knows what she needs to work. Someone who can make her grandmother's cake and show up for her own birthday even when no one else does. I said, someone who knows the correct mustard to grilled cheese ratio. She smiled. She said, extra on the side, because you might want more. I said that's the kind of precision that usually takes decades to arrive at. She looked at me. She said, Cal. I said, yeah. She said, thank you for sitting down. The night of the birthday had been November. January had been Diane. February was quiet and good in the way that things can be quiet and good when nothing is being evaded. We went to Patsy's. We walked Patterson through the community garden. I showed her the plot where zucchini would eventually return to terrorize me, and she crouched down and looked at the soil with the serious attention she gave to insects. She said, it's good soil. I said, it produces too much zucchini. She said, you're probably planting too densely. I said, this is what I get for bringing an expert. She smiled and stood up and her shoulder touched mine in the cold. In March, the Nature Guide came out. The publisher sent advance copies and Ren set one on my kitchen table without saying anything. I opened it. The botanical illustrations ran through the whole book, each one filling a page: the beetle, the carpenter ant, the bumblebee, a series of wildflowers with their root systems visible below the soil line. There was a dedication on the page before the first illustration, for the people who look closely. I thought about Danny for a moment. I thought about the way he wrapped things in newspaper and showed up with exactly what you'd asked for. I thought about how showing up is its own kind of looking closely, doing it again and again until the other person stops being surprised. I closed the book and put it carefully on the shelf. That evening she came over and Patterson immediately relocated to her lap. She sat on my couch and let him, resigned to his affections in the way she'd resigned herself to everything about being here: the small apartment, the good light, the slow accumulation of a life she had chosen carefully. I sat beside her. She said, I've been here 6 months. I said, since November. She said, "That's when you sat down." I said, "That's when you blew out the candles." She looked at me. She said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I used to think that the thing I was afraid of was the episode, what happened in Pittsburgh. But I've been thinking about it, and I think what I was actually afraid of was what came before it. The years of not looking at what I was doing, not asking what I needed, just running the version that seemed acceptable until it wasn't." She said, "Elkhart was supposed to be temporary, just a place to breathe until I figured out the next thing." I waited. She said it stopped being temporary around December. I said, "The Basil." She said, "You." It was you. The apartment was quiet. Patterson shifted on her lap and resettled. I reached over and took her hand. She said, "I'm not saying I have everything sorted. I'm not saying the version of me that didn't look closely is gone." I said, "I'm not asking for sorted. I'm asking for here." She looked at me. I said, "I want you to be here, Ren. That's the whole of it. Here in Elkhart with the north light and the sketchbook and the mustard on the side. Here when you're mostly all right and here when you're less than that. I want to be the person you call before you go 11 days without leaving." She was very still. I said, "I think I've wanted to say that since approximately the birthday cake." She said, "You've known me 6 months." I said, "Danny used to say that some things you know before you're supposed to. He said the trick is not to talk yourself out of them." She looked at me. Her eyes were bright. She said, "Tell me about Danny." So I did. For the first time since March 2 years ago, I talked about him, not around him, not in the past tense that held him at a distance, but about him. His birthday calls, the newspaper wrapping, the particular way he sat in a room that made a room feel full. She listened the way she looked at things, with complete attention. When I stopped, we sat for a while. She said, "I think he would have shown up." I said, "Without question." She leaned into my shoulder. Patterson, deeply satisfied with the arrangement, did not move. I said, "I need to ask you something." She said, "Okay." I said, "The apartment on Maple. Are you staying?" She said, "My lease is renewed." I said, "When did that happen?" She said, "Last week. I told the new owners I wasn't leaving. They found someone else to renovate." She said, "I found a lead on a studio space on the same block. Better north light than the apartment. I told them I'd need it by September." I said, "Ren." She said, "I'm staying." She said it plainly. The way you say something when you've already made peace with it. I thought about the table for 8. The paper banner. The 8 plates, 8 glasses, one person sitting very straight with the expression of someone who has been waiting long enough to stop expecting anyone. She was expecting someone now. I kissed her. She kissed me back. Outside it was March and the community garden was still dormant and the basil on her windowsill was surviving, which she considered a victory and I considered evidence. We stayed like that for a while. Patterson made a sound that was not a complaint. Diane came back in March, as promised. She sat in the corner booth at Patsy's and ordered coffee and looked around the diner with the expression of someone recalibrating their previous conclusions. She looked at Ren, who was eating a grilled cheese with the mustard on the side and describing the studio space on Maple Street with precision and enthusiasm. Diane said, "You're happy." Ren considered the question seriously, which is how she considered all questions. She said, "I'm better than all right. I think happy is somewhere in that range." Diane looked at me. She said, "Thank you for sitting down." I said it was a good cake. Diane made the almost laugh sound again. I was coming to understand it was the closest she came to being entirely herself. She said to Ren, "Your father would have liked him." Ren smiled. She said, "I know." October brought the kind of light Elkhart does well, low and golden, slanting through the windows in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look more considered than it is. Ren's studio was open by then. She had the botanical illustrations from the nature guide framed on one wall and new work in progress on the board. A series of moths. She said moths were underappreciated and she intended to correct that. I went on a Wednesday to bring lunch and stayed 2 hours watching her work. She stood at the table and she was absolutely still and absolutely present, looking at a reference photograph of a Luna moth with the complete attention she gave to everything she loved. She said, "Come look at this wing." I came around the table and looked at the wing. The detail was extraordinary. Each scale rendered individually the color gradations from pale green to gold at the edge. I said, "You're going to need 3 days for that." She said, "At least." She looked up at me. The studio light was good, pale, and even exactly what she'd needed. She said, "Cal," I said, "Yeah." She said, "Happy birthday." I looked at her. She said, "It's your birthday." I looked it up. I said, "You looked it up." She said, "Patterson told me." I said, "Patterson cannot speak." She said, "He can if you give him the specific biscuit he likes." He said it was definitely today. She reached under the table and produced a small box wrapped in newspaper. I looked at the newspaper wrapping. She said, "I know, Danny." She said it gently. I thought it might be right. I unwrapped it. Inside was an illustration, a Luna moth finished, the wing detail done with the patience she brought to everything. In the lower right corner in her small, careful hand, she'd written 2 words, "Still here." I looked at it for a long moment. She said, "You can tell me if it's too much." I said, "It's exactly right." She reached over and took my hand. We stood in the studio in the October light, the moths in progress on the board, the city quiet outside. Patterson was at home, probably napping on the good cushion. The basil on the apartment windowsill was still alive. The corner booth at Patsy's would be there Saturday. I thought about a paper banner in a diner and 8 empty chairs and a woman sitting very straight, waiting without expecting. I thought about Danny. I thought about showing up, about how it's the only thing in the end that counts. She was still holding my hand. I said, "Happy birthday, Ren, 6 months late." She laughed, the real one, all the way through, no moderation. We went to Patsy's. We sat at the corner table, just the two of us. She ordered the grilled cheese with the mustard on the side. I ordered the coffee I'd never quite gotten around to taking to go. The light in the diner was warm and yellow. Outside it was October in Elkhart and the community garden was winding down and the studio was open and the basil was alive and everything that mattered was in some form present. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. She said, "Do you know what I was thinking that night in November, when you came in and picked up the chair?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "I was thinking, I'll sit here for 20 more minutes and then I'll go home." I'd already decided. The banner would come down. I'd take the extra plates back to the cabinet. I'd cut myself a piece of cake and eat it at the table for one and that would be the birthday. She said, "And then you walked in." I said, "I almost didn't stop." She said, "But you did." She looked at me. She said, "You picked up a chair and walked across the room and you sat down and you said happy birthday. And that is the exact moment, Cal. That is where this whole thing started." The diner was warm. Patsy was giving us the look from across the room that meant she was going to start stacking chairs whether we'd finished or not. Ren was looking at me. I thought about all the evenings since then. The sketchbook and the cuttings and Patterson on her lap and the newspaper wrapping and the moth with the impossible wings. I thought about 3 words still here in her small, careful hand. I said, "It's a good place to start from." She smiled. We stayed until Patsy made it clear, firmly and with warmth, that the kitchen was done and had been done, and we walked out into October and she took my arm on the sidewalk and we walked back toward the studio. The community garden was 2 blocks north. The corner booth would be there Saturday. Diane would call Sunday. The basil was still growing. I thought about Danny and his newspaper and his birthday calls and the way he always arrived with exactly what you asked for. I thought, this is the thing he meant. You know before you're supposed to. The trick is not to talk yourself out of it. Some things start from the smallest ordinary decision, a chair pulled from a nearby table, a walk across a room, 2 words offered to a stranger in a diner. And sometimes those 2 words turn out to be the beginning of everything.